Hello everyone and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We are holding in Mishnah Berurah Chelik Vav. We'll be learning today Mirz Hashem Daf Lamed Vav Amid Beis. We're beginning a brand new Siman, Siman Tov Kuf Samach, Lasais Zecher L'Churban. The obligation to make a zecher, to make a remembrance for the Churban. Now before we begin the words of the Mechaber, let's take a look right away at the first sentence over here in the Mishnah Berurah. This is a little bit of a hakdama, a little bit of a preface to this Siman. The Chavetz Chaim says, Tiknu, Shekol Dvar Simcha. Anytime we're involved in something that has a nature of simchah, whenever we're involved in something that has to do with rejoicing or a lot of joy, Tzarech Lasais Ba Davar Zecher L'Churban Habayis. We have to do something as a zecher to the Churban Habayis, to the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. This is as we find in the pasuk in Tehillim, where David HaMelech says, "Imloi ales Yerushalayim al rosh simchasi." If I don't place Yerushalayim, if I don't place the remembrance of Yerushalayim first and foremost al rosh simchasi, above my simcha. So whenever we engage in simcha, it is incumbent upon us to make a zecher l'churban, to do something to dampen our joy a little bit, to remember the loss of the Beis HaMikdash and the destruction of Yerushalayim. And if you take a look in the Mishnah, in the Dirshu, in footnote number 1, the very powerful footnote over here, Val Goydel HaChoyva Liskar Es Churban Beis HaMikdash, in regard to the great obligation to always have a remembrance for the Churban, Kasav Again Rabbi Yaakov Emden. Rabbi Yaakov Emden writes in his Siddur, if this would be the only avera that we have in our hands, that we don't mourn properly over the Beis HaMikdash, this would be sufficient to make our gullus drag on and to make our gullus continue. V'zu hasiba kroiva hayoser gluya atzuma v'chazaka. And Rabbi Yaakov Emden says that this is the cause. This is the greatest cause and the most revealed and powerful cause. L'chal hashmadais hamuflagais hagedolos hanoros hamavhilos hara'ayonim asher matzanu begolos b'chol makomos pizreinu. Rabbi Yaakov Emden says that this fact that we don't mourn sufficiently over the Churban, that, Rabbi Yaakov Emden says, is the most obvious and the most powerful cause for all of the terrible things that have befallen Klal Yisrael throughout the generations in our Gullus. Al tzavarenu nirdafnu, we are chased by our necks. Leihunach lanu lahargia b'goyim, we're never given a chance to rest. Im shiflusenu, anyenu umerudenu, through all of our oppressions. The reason is because that mourning, that feeling of great loss and mourning over the Beis HaMikdash has left our hearts. When we're at peace in a land which is not ours. We have forgotten Yerushalayim. And the memory of it and the mourning of it doesn't go on our hearts. And because of that, we have been forgotten like a mace, milidar lidar, from generation to generation. Noisef yagain al yagainenu. Travails and worries are added on upon us, umachevenu, and our pains. So Rabbi Yaakov Emden is telling us over here, you want to know why the Gullus Nebuch drags on? He says one of the reasons the Gullus, not one of the reasons, the most obvious and the most powerful reason is because we don't mourn over the loss of the Beis HaMikdash. We don't mourn over the loss of Yerushalayim, what it is that we're missing. We have to realize that the whole point of Klal Yisrael, the purpose of Klal Yisrael, is to have an ummah where the Rebbeinu Shalom could bring the Shechina and reside amongst us. We're supposed to be living a Torah-dik life. We're supposed to be living a Ruchniistic life, which is a life that the Rebbeinu Shalom wants to give us a Beis HaMikdash. What does that mean? The Rebbeinu Shalom wants to be comfortable living amongst us. The Rebbeinu Shalom wants to be mashresh chinasai b'seichenu, the parshas that we're learning of building the Mishkan, and having a Mizbeach, and having an Aron HaKodesh, and everything else, that means that the Rabbeinu Shalom is Mashresh Chinasai B'Seichenu. He brings the divine presence amongst us. But in order to be roi for that, in order to be worthy for that, we have to be an Ummah, we have to be a nation that lives al pi Torah HaKdosha. We have to be a nation that is Mamala, the Ratzon HaBoirei, that makes the Rabbeinu Shalom happy to be amongst us. And the idea that we're not misabel on the Beis HaMikdash and not misabel on Yerushalayim, Nebuch, what that could mean is that we have lost the vision, we've lost sight of what our purpose is. Our purpose is not to be a nation like all the other nations and just, we go to daven 3 times a day and we learn Daf Yomi. That's not our purpose. Our purpose is not to be like everybody else with a little ruchnius and a little Torah and a little tefillah sprinkled in. We're supposed to be very different than everybody else. We're supposed to be an ummah that's dedicated completely to Ratzon HaBoirei, to living a different kind of life, to living a ruchniistic life, not a gashmiistic life. If we forget that, and we stop mourning over the Beis HaMikdash, if we don't realize that without the Beis HaMikdash we're not living up to what we're supposed to be, then Rabbi Yaakov Emden says, then Nebuch, that's why we have the Gullus, why the Gullus drags on. If we could be comfortable here in the United States, if we could be comfortable, as long as we're not being oppressed and they basically leave us alone and let us do our thing, if we could be comfortable in that way, that's a big problem. How could we be comfortable? Like I've said many, many times, where's the urgency? We have to realize that this is gefährlich. This is not, even if they leave us alone completely. So what? How many of the Taryag mitzvahs are we not being Mekayim? We can't be Mekayim the mitzvahs of Tluyas Ba'aretz. We can't be Mekayim the mitzvahs of Kachim. We can't be Mekayim the mitzvahs of Taharis. There's so many of the Taryag mitzvahs that we can't even begin to be Mekayim because of the way that we're living. We don't have a Korban Pesach, we don't have Korbanos, we don't have the Avodah of Yom Kippur, and there's so much that we don't have. We don't have a Sanhedrin, and we don't have Yiras Chet the same way, maybe because we don't have a Bezdin that can give you Malchus. So there's our life is not the way it's supposed to be. And if you forget that Avel, if you forget that mourning, then you forgot your purpose. And if you forget your purpose, then Nebuch, the Gullus continues. Okay. So now let's take a look at the Mechaber here in Sif Aleph. The Mechaber says, Mishacharav Beis HaMikdash, from the time that the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, Tiknu Chachamim Shahayu Ba'oisai Hadar. The Chazal that lived during that time, during the generation of the Churban. And this comes from a Braisa in Baba Basra. So this comes from the Tanoim. And the words that the Mechaber is going to write now is really it's really taken straight out of a Rambam. And it echoes very closely the words of the Braisa. So Mishachar of Beis HaMikdash, from the time of the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, Tiknu Chachamim Shahayu Ba'oisai Hadar. The Chazal of that generation were Mesakin, they decreed, She'ein Bainim La'olam Binyan Mesuyad Umechuyar Kebinyan HaMalachim. That we no longer build a structure, Mesuyad Umechuyar. Now we're going to see in the Mishnah Berurah, the Mishnah Berurah is going to tell us that there are 2 possible pshatim here. One pshat is that Mesuyad Umechuyar means decorated. These are different types of decorations, different types of plastering and making decorations on the walls. In that case, what the Mechaber is saying is, She'ein bainin la'olam binyan Mesuyad Umechuyar kebinyan HaMalachim. We no longer build decorated houses in the style that the Malachim, that the princes and the royalty built. Ella, rather, what do? Tach beisai betit. We simply smear the house with cement. Visad besid. And then we plaster over the cement with a white plaster. Umishayer mokoim al ama. But we leave over one area, 1 amma by 1 amma in size, keneged haPesach. And we do this opposite the entrance to the house. Beloy Sid, we leave that without the white plaster. So understood this way, what the Mechaber seems to be saying is, we don't build a beautiful decorated house. Instead, we build a house, we do the basic smearing with cement, then we could put a white plaster over it, but opposite the front door to the house, opposite the entrance, we leave an amma by amma square of just bare cement, without the white sid. Okay. Let's take a look now at the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah Ois Katan Aleph. Mesuyad u'mechuyar, says the Chavetz Chaim, heim mine tzir. He brings down from the Kesef Mishnah, and this is the first pshat brought down by the Kesef Mishnah, that mesuyad u'mechuyar means different types of decorations. And again, understood this way, what the Mechaber is saying is, we don't build a binyan mitzuyar. We don't build a decorated house. Instead, we just do this type of plain plastering. Now, understood this way, what the Mechaber is saying you can do is you can do a regular plaster job and leave an amma by amma square without the finished coat, without the top coat of the white sid. Now, do you necessarily need a double coat of plain cement underneath and then white sid on top and leave one amma by amma square without the top coat? No. That's just the typical way it was done. They did an undercoating of cement and then a top coat of a more decorative, a nice white sid. And the Mechaber is telling you, don't build in a decorative fashion. Just do the typical cement with the typical top coat of the white sid and leave an amma by amma square without the top coat. If you want, you could skip the regular cement. If you want to do a coating of only sid, of only the same material that they used for that top coat, and you want to leave an amma by amma bare, you could do that too. What you can't do is you can't build a binyan mesuya de mechuya. You can't build a decorated house. That's the first pshat in the Kesef Mishnah. Now the Chavetz Chaim tells you there's also a possible second pshat. Ve'efshar loymar, or you could say that there's another pshat. The way the common folk built their houses was they did this bottom coat of cement and a top coat of sid. But the royalty, oisen hakoil besid. They didn't do the bottom coat of cement and the top coat of sid. They did everything using sid. And understood that way, what the Mechaber and the Rambam would be telling you is, afilu besid levadai aser. Then the Mechaber is being more strict. What the Mechaber is telling you is, ein bainim la'olam binyan miyusad m'chuyar kebinyan amalachim. We don't build like the royalty do, which is to build with only sid without a bottom coat of cement. We don't do that. So you want to build your house using only sid? No, we don't do that. You have to have tit underneath and then sid, and you have to leave an amma without the top coat. So this would be more strict. It's not only that you can't build a decorated binyan, you can't even build this binyan without the tit, just with the sid. Those are two possible pshatim in the Rambam, brought down by the Kesef Mishnah. Okay, now continues the Chavetz Chaim. The Chavetz Chaim says, from the words of the Mechaber taken from the Rambam, where it says, she'ein bainim la'olam binyan mesuyid u'mechuyir kebinyan amalachim, that means we never build this binyan amalachim. We never build a binyan mesuyid u'mechuyir. Never. Mashma, the implication of that is, says the Chavetz Chaim, ta'afilu al yidei shior amma al amma oser bazeh. Sounds from the Mechaber, from the Rambam, that this that we leave over an amma al amma square that's bare without the sid, that's not matter you to build a binyan mesuyid u'mechuyir. You're never allowed to build a binyan mesuyid u'mechuyir. Whether that means a decorated house, or it means just the top coat of the white, the pure white without the tit, you're never allowed to do that. Leaving an amma al amma square zecher l'churban is not matter you to go build like the binyan malachim. That's what it sounds like. And rather, what the Mechaber is saying is that we could never build. Just, you have to build very simple, tit underneath, sit on top, with a 1 amma by 1 amma square. V'hinei ha-Mechaber hetek lashon Rambam. And the Mechaber is coming off of the Rambam. Aval das HaTorah, however, Chavetz Chaim says that the opinion of the Torah is, da'afilu sadin besid, you're even allowed to build a house with only sid, without the undercoat of cement. Umitzayrin nami, and you could also decorate the house, and mahani shior amma al amma, as long as you leave this amma by amma square as a zecher l'churban, v'chein minig, and the Chavetz Chaim says that is the minig, and that's what you see nowadays. People build a house, and they build plenty fancy, and we'll speak about that a little bit later. They build plenty fancy and finished and painted and designed and decorated and tiled and everything else, and just they leave an amma by an amma square opposite the entranceway unfinished, plain sheetrock, and that's the zecher l'churban. Okay, and the Mechaber said, let's go to Sif Beis. What do you do? Tach beisoy betit. You coat your house with cement. V'sad besid, and then you put a top coat of white plaster. Or meshayer, and then you leave the makom amma al amma. You leave an amma on by an amma square unfinished as a zecher l'churban. Says the Chavetz Chaim, Hainu she'oisei amma yeh b'loy sid rak betit levad. So it comes out that you did a bottom coat of cement, and now you're putting on a top coat of white sid, and you're leaving an amma by an amma without the top coat. So that means that you'll have an amma by an amma of only cement, of bare tit. Now, if you use this sid, this lime, that was the top coat, but you don't use pure sid, you mix in sand, nami shari al yedei shiur amma al amma, you still need to leave an amma by an amma. Don't think that because you mixed sand into the sid, now somehow you degraded the quality of the sid, and now you don't need an amma by an amma, you still need an amma by an amma. And the Chavetz Chaim says, V'yesh makilin al yedei chayil. However, there are those, he brings this down from the Mamar Mordechai, there are those that are mekel and say that if you mix sand into the plaster, into the sid, then you don't need the amma by an amma. They hold that once you mix sand into the sid, that's not called that you finished off your house with a top coat of sid, and therefore you don't need an amma by an amma zecher l'churban. Now the Chavetz Chaim says in our days, many people don't have this minig to leave an amma by an amma zecher l'churban. Ve'efsher, and it's possible, he says, mishum desaimchen al yesh makilin. It's possible that they rely on this kuladik opinion of the Mamar Mordechai, and that they mix in sand in the sid, and therefore they feel that they don't have to leave a zecher l'churban. Val kol panim, however, says the Chavetz Chaim, tamua, it's a wonder, sharei malabdan abatim b'sid levad, because they do finish the house with pure sid, without chayil. Ve'afsher dedafka b'minei sid anikra gufsh shu lavan b'yoser aser ma she'en ken sid shalanu. The Chavetz Chaim tries to be malamet schus. He says maybe it's because they go ahead and they don't use this very white type of sid. However, calls it doichik. He says this is all a doichik. V'tzarch iyan al ma noyeg in heter, and we really have to look into why people are noyeg a heter, why they think that they don't need the amma by an amma zecher l'churban. V'hechashu tach petit levad, and if they just use cement without any sid, l'kuli alma ain't tzarch l'shayr klal, then everybody would agree that you don't have to leave an amma by an amma. So this, there's some complexities here that don't seem to be negeya so much to us, because we're talking about different styles of building. We don't do this. We don't use this tit. We put up sheetrock, and then we paint over the sheetrock. So common practice seems to be that if you're building a house, so people leave Keneged HaPesach opposite the front door, they leave plain sheetrock. They leave an unfinished amma by an amma where they don't put on any sheetrock, they don't anything. They just leave it there without paint, without anything else. They leave it raw, and that is the zecher l'churban. Okay. Ice cut and gimel. The Mechaber said that you do this Keneged HaPesach. You do it opposite the front door. Hainu noichach HaPesach, opposite the doorway. Kedei sheyeroeh miyad sheyikones ba'Pesach. Because the point is, we want somebody to walk into the house and see right away the unfinished piece. That's the zecher l'churban. There are those that have a custom to leave the unfinished zecher l'churban above the door. And then the person who's walking into the house does not see it. The Efsher, he says, it's possible that the reason they do this is because instead of the one walking into the house seeing it, The people who are accustomed to leaving the zecher l'churban over the door, they want the owner of the house to constantly see the zecher l'churban. And he says, I guess at least in the style of the Chavetz Chaim's days, where I'm sure the houses were much smaller, people were very commonly sitting inside the house opposite the door, so they always saw the zecher l'churban, and they want the one living in the house to see the zecher l'churban. So he brings this down from the Shari Tshuva, va'oisai hashir yeh b'lo sid, and they would leave that without any plastering. Udaloi ka'oisan ha'oisan ama shachar. And he says, don't do what some people do is, where they don't leave an unfinished patch as a zecher l'churban. Instead, they paint it black. His Chavetz Chaim says you shouldn't do that. He brings it down for the Levush, Dezeu gam kein tziur, because the fact that you painted an amma by an amma black is also decorated. You painted it black. You took a square and you painted it black. We don't want it decorated. We want it raw. We want it unfinished. That's the zecher l'churban. However, the Chavetz Chaim says, v'yesh mekayimai she'oisin shachar, there are places where they do make it black, the kaisven al zeh zecher l'churban, and they write on it zecher l'churban. Okay, he brings this down. If you look in the Shar Tzion, he brings this down. Let's take a look at Shar Tzion Ois Katan Ches. After Chai Adam Machmir Gam Bozeh, even though the Chai Adam says you should not do this, you shouldn't make it black and write on it zecher l'churban. You should just leave it plain. Mikamakam, nevertheless, the Chavetz Chaim says, Nira de'ein limchais b'yad ha'makilin. We should not object to people who have this kula. Again, what do? They take the amma by an amma that's the zecher l'churban, they paint it black, and they write on it zecher l'churban. He says, don't object to people who do that. Acharei she'el Yerabba hevi b'shem ha'aguda, because we find that the El Yerabba brings down in the name of the aguda, smach lahamakilin, something for these makilin to rely on, she'oisin shachar amakamahu, that they make that area that's the zecher l'churban black. Now, if you take a look in the Dirshu, in footnote number 9, which is found in the back in the Miluim on page 21. He says over here, brings down from the Rishiva Zatzal, from Rav Moshe in the Igris, Ubebir Taimai Shel HaAguda, as far as the rationale of the Aguda, V'limud Tzchus Al HaMakilim, and to be Malamed Tzchus on those that make the area black and write on it zecher l'churban, Kasav B'Shalos Tshuva Sigos Moshe, She'ikar HaTakana. What is the point of the takana to leave an area that's a zecher l'churban? Eino ligareya b'mayit miyipoy abayis. The point is not to lessen the beauty of the house. Ela laseis heker b'bayis she is zecher l'churban. The point is to make something that's a zecher l'churban. So then even if you blacken it with black paint, yesh bazeh zikaron l'churban. That is a zikaron, a remembrance for the churban. Shahashcharus, the blackening, who's siman la'avelus, making something black is a siman for avelus. Uchein dvar of kasav kvar kasav Aruch HaShulchan, and the Aruch HaShulchan writes something similar to that. Okay. So again, when we build a house, we have to leave an amma by an amma square. We have to leave an amma by an amma raw as a zecher l'churban. Okay. Says, continues the Mishnah Berurah in Ois Katan Gimel, right by the Ois Katan Tes for the Shar Tzion. V'oisan ha'toilin bigdei rikma saviv kol haksalim. Somebody who decorates their house by hanging draperies around, over all the walls. They hang fabric over the walls instead of painting them. Yeshayru gamkein amma al amma. They should also leave an amma by an amma that's not covered by these draperies. Okay, let's go back to the Mechaber here in middle of Sif Katan Aleph. So the Mechaber has introduced to us the concept and the minig that when you build a house, you have to leave this amma by an amma opposite the doorway, unfinished as a zecher l'churban. Now, says the Mechaber, and this is something that's very negeya, let's say you purchase a house from a non-Jew that was already decorated, already plastered, already painted. Pirish mitzuyeres, over here the Ramah says mitzuyedes and mitzuyeres, meaning it's already all decorated. Harezu b'cheskasa, it has a chazaka And the Mishnah Berurah is going to say, what this means, it has a chazaka that it was done by an Eino Yehudi. It has a chazaka that it was decorated beheter by a non-Jew, and you're not mechuyev to go change it. Ve'ein mechayev oisai likloif baksalim. We're not going to be mechayev you to go peel the plastering off of the wall and create a zecher l'churban. The concept of the zecher l'churban is, you go build a house, that's a big simchah, you have to make a dent in that simchah. The way you make a dent in that simchah is you leave an amma by amma square that's unfinished as a zecher l'churban. But if you bought the house and the house was already done by a non-Jew, you're not mechuyev now to go ahead and knock off something from the house and create the zecher l'churban. That the Mechaber says you're not mechuyev to do. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ois Katan Daled B'ches Kasa, the Talinon Shenasa B'Yadakum Ulekacha Yisrael Mimenu. We assume that it was you bought the house from a non-Jew, and it was done beheter. Vim Yadua Shenasa B'Yad Yisrael B'Isser. However, if you bought the house from a Yid, and you know that the Yid built the house, so you know that the Yid, you're buying a house from a Yid. You know that the Yid built the house, and there's no zecher l'churban. So that means it was done b'isser. Chayiv likleif amma al amma. Then you do have to break off, you have to peel off an amma by an amma because it was done b'isser. If it was done b'heter, you could leave it. If it was done b'isser, you have to peel it off. V'chol zekishu kayim. This is only true as long as the house is still standing. Aval kishenofal. If the house fell down, afilim yadua shebapam harishon hayu b'yadakum. Even though the original house was built by a non-Jew, we don't say that it's grandfathered and now you don't need a zecher l'churban. When you go rebuild the house, you have to go ahead and leave an amma by an amma. Now, what happens if you're repainting? What happens if you bought a house from a non-Jew? So, okay, now you don't need a zecher l'churban. It was bought from a non-Jew. But now you're repainting the area, the front room of the house. So the area Keneged HaPesach, you're repainting. Are you mechuyev to leave an amma by an amma unpainted? That seems to be a machlokes hapaiskim. Some hold that painting is not the equivalent of plastering. Like we said, the common practice is when the house is being built, you leave raw sheetrock over there. That's how you leave the amma by an amma. Now it was already painted. You're repainting it. Am I mechuyev to leave an amma by an amma unrepainted? That seems to be a machlokes hapaiskim. If it's the guy, you should ask a shaila. Okay. Now let's go to Sif Beis. You know what? Let's just take a look at the Biur Halacha here. Dibur HaMaschil she'ein bainin la'olam, says the Chavetz Chaim, ubeis HaKnesses ubeis HaMedrash shari b'chol inyan. When you're building a shul, you're building a bais medrash, that you're allowed to build however you want. Hainu af besid lechud, you could use pure plaster without tit underneath. Ubeloi shir amma al amma, you don't need an amma by an amma. So basically the Chavetz Chaim is telling you, you don't need a zecher l'churban when you build a shul. In footnote number 12, again in the back, on page 21 by the Miluim, he brings down here, Ubetama davar, why don't you need a zecher l'churban by a shul? Kasa b'shal setubas minchas alazar, the Munkach Rav writes, the takana was not made on a place that's set aside for mitzvahs, like a shul. Over there, they didn't make the takana of a zecher l'churban. Reb Chaim Kanievsky later in this footnote says different. He says it was made on the residence of an individual. It wasn't made on public buildings. And if you look further in that footnote, he has a nafkamina and halacha between Reb Chaim Kanievsky and the Minchas Elazar. Okay, now Sif Beis. Very interesting Sif. I think it'll take people by surprise. Says the Mechaber, V'chein hiskinu, they also decreed, Sheha'orich shulchan lasei suda la'archim. When somebody is making a suda, now it doesn't mean when you sit down to eat supper at night. The Mechaber says, Sheha'orich shulchan lasei suda la'archim. When you're making a suda with guests, you're inviting people over, you're having a chosh of a suda. Mechaser mimenu ma'at. You should leave something out. What does that mean to leave something out? Says the Mishnah Berurah in Ois Katan Daled, in Ois Katan Hey. Lasei suda la'archim. First he says, afilu sudas mitzvah. This halacha is going to be true even if you're making the Sudas mitzvah. Kemila, like you're making the Suda of a bris. V'chasana, you're making a wedding. V'choshke and shar Sudas. Certainly other Sudas where it's a chashav a Suda where you have guests, but if it's not a Suda shal mitzvah, certainly this halacha applies. V'ayin b'maru kitzia the besuda Shabbos v'yom tov lo yichaseh shum davar. For Shabbos and Yom Tov you don't have to leave anything out. Ois katan vav mechaseh mimenu ma'at. The Mechaber says you should leave something out of the Suda. What does that mean? Koloimar, what the Mechaber wants to say is, she'ein noisin kol tafshilim, you don't put out all of the dishes, haru'uyim l'su'uda, that would normally be proper for such a Suda. Ela mechaseh ma'at, rather you have to leave something out. So what the Mechaber seems to be saying is, you're making a chashav a Suda, so you sit down with your wife to make the menu, and you say, okay, what are we serving for the farshbais? What's the appetizer going to be? And then maybe we'll have a soup after the appetizer. So maybe we'll have a fruit cup, and then after the fruit cup we'll have a soup, and then after the soup we're going to have a main dish, and then by the main dish we're going to have two sides. We're going to have a starch and we're going to have a vegetable, and then maybe we'll put out on the table, besides what's going on everybody's plate, we'll put out, a few salads, and we'll have coleslaw and pickles and a corn salad and a carrot salad, and then we're going to have dessert, and maybe we should have two types of desserts. So says the Mechaber, you figure out what would be roi, what would be typical to have by such a Suda, and now zecher l'churban, you have to leave out a dish. That's what the Mechaber says, right? Let's go back into the Mechaber. So v'chein iskinu, similarly they decreed, sheha'ara shulchan lachse Suda la'archim, you're making a nice Suda where you're inviting guests, let's say a sheva brachas, mechasa b'menu ma'at, you leave something out. And another interesting halacha, umaniach makom panui b'loi ka'ara, and you leave out an empty place without a plate. Min ha'ka'arais ha'ru'uyais laseis sham. You leave out one of the plates. There would be a plate here, but you leave out one of the plates. Now, what does this mean? Says the Mishnah Berurah in Ois Katan Zayin. What is it? Oh wait, I didn't finish Ois Katan Vav. Right by the Ois Katan Yudalid for the Sharet Zion. You have to leave something out. You leave one of the dishes that you would normally serve by such a meal. Continues the Mishnah Berurah. Afilu kasa de horsana daibazeh. Even if you were going to serve some kind of little fried fish, you leave that out. In other words, that's something that's considered small. You have to leave out something. So you were going to serve coleslaw and pickles, leave out the pickles. You have to leave out something, even if it's something small. I know pickles aren't small. Pickles are a big deal. So if you were going to serve pickles and coleslaw and olives, leave out the olives. Ois Katan Zayin, umaniach mokoim panui. The Mechaber says you have to leave an empty space on the table. There's a plate that you have to leave out. Explains the Chavetz Chaim, because if you don't leave out a plate, lo yeh nikar hachesaron. Nobody realizes that anything is missing. Aval kishi aniach panui, but when you leave something empty, yargishu, then people will realize shahayaroi oi tavshel, that really you were going to bring out another dish. Elishen nechsar, just you left it out. V'hine halavush hishbit tnaizeh, the lavush leaves out this. Efshe disfirle de bechasa ba'at lavad asagi. Maybe the lavush held that just leaving something out is enough. Now, from this Mishnah Berurah over here, it sounds like what the Mechaber means when the Mechaber says that you leave out a mokum panui b'loi ka'ara mina ka'arais. What it means is they had a way to serve the table. So the lakshan kugel went over here. The potato kugel went over here. The pickles went over here. Now you're going to leave out a dish. How is anybody going to know that you left out the dish? No one's going to know that you left out a dish. So what do? You leave out, this is where the potato kugel normally goes. You leave the potato kugel spot empty. Now everybody goes and they realize, oh, that's where the potato kugel would be. And the potato kugel is not there. If the potato kugel is not there, then it sounds like, then we could see that something was left out. That something was left out. They left out something from the meal. Otherwise, how did they know that you left something out? Maybe you just made laksha kugel and you didn't make potato kugel. So that's what the Mishnah Berurah seems to understand that the Mechaber means when the Mechaber says leave out a ka'ara. It means leave out a serving dish, but leave it out in such a way that everybody would understand that something is missing. Now, there's another footnote that I want to read, but before that I want to read a bir halacha here. Look at the Bir Halacha. V'chein iskinu shaha'ira shulchan ukisheisha oisa ukishachasa naisa. We didn't read those yet in the Mechaber. But look what the Bir Halacha says here. He says v'tzar chiyun. The Chavetz Chaim says we need to research this. Shekol zeh ein nehagin klal. He brings down from the Chai Adam. We need iyun. Nobody does this. Nobody leaves out a dish. Nobody leaves out any of the dishes that they would normally serve. Nobody leaves out an empty plate or an empty spot on the table. And the Chavetz Chaim says tzar chiyun. I don't know why. So if you like, take a look at Dirshu footnote number 16. They bring down here from the Kaf HaChaim. Kaf HaChaim Kosav, he says the Kaf HaChaim writes, Tam Lakach. He gives a reason why people aren't noyeg like this nowadays. He says, Shedafka bizmanehem. It was only in the times of Chazal. Shahaya seder l'tavshilim shemivim lifnei ha'orchim. They served in a very, very formal fashion. And it was very well known what was going to be served. It's not like nowadays where when you come to a Suda, you have no idea what they're going to serve. In those days, there was an etiquette, and there was a typical style. They served in a certain way, and they served certain dishes. It's kind of like, until the younger generation nowadays I go to some Shabbos Suda sometimes, and I don't recognize any of the foods that were being served. When I was growing up, the typical, you went for a Friday night Suda somewhere, it was gefilte fish, and then chicken soup, and then chicken and potato kugel, or maybe Lakshan kugel, or maybe both. And then a dessert. It was anywhere you went, you knew what's coming out on the table. You knew gefilte fish, maybe a piece of carp, a piece of whitefish if they're getting fancy, but you knew it's going to be fish, chicken soup, chicken and kugel, and then maybe a little something else on the side and a dessert. So if you serve in that style, then if you leave something out, everybody realizes something was left out. So then you have a zecher l'churban. If you leave out the gefilte fish, nicker shu zecher l'churban. Then everybody realizes you made a zecher l'churban. Avo bizmanenu. But in our days, she'ein seder, where there is no such order, there is no such etiquette. Everybody serves whatever they serve, according to their station, according to their standards. You go to the younger generation now, I don't even recognize the foods. They're serving sushi and wraps and this and that. In Cain, kishamachasar tafshil, then if a dish is left out, ain't a nicker, nobody realizes that there's a zecher l'churban. They look and they say, this is the style, or this is the ability of what this person has to serve. He's not so well off, he can't serve so many side dishes. And therefore, the Kaf HaChaim says, that's why we don't have this minhag. However, the Kaf HaChaim concludes and he says, you still should have an empty spot on the table where it's obvious that you're leaving a dish out. So there should be some heker by the sud of zecher l'churban. V'yechaven alav shu zecher l'churban. Now, if you take a look at the Aruch HaShulchan, the Aruch HaShulchan writes, he says like this. He says, V'akshav ein anu yoydin mizeh. The Aruch HaShulchan says, we don't know anything about this. Not only we're not noyeg this way, he says like this is unheard of. We don't know anything about this. V'kasha hatziur lifanenu ma'hu ha'mokim hapanui. The Aruch HaShulchan says we can't even understand, we can't even imagine, what does this mean to leave an empty spot? Think about it. In the way we serve, what does it mean to leave an empty spot on the table? There's no official place. What, you should put out an empty serving platter? Is that what it means? You should put out an empty serving platter so everybody realizes, oh, what's that? That's the zecher l'churban? Maybe, but Aruch HaShulchan already says that nowadays we don't know from this. So that's what the Bir Halacha says here. Okay, so I guess we're going to stop over here. We'll continue with Hashem tomorrow. We'll pick up with the Ukisheha Isha, second to last line on Lamed Vav Amud Beis. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. Discussing limud HaTorah should be megan against Klal Yisrael. The Rebbeinu Shalom should send Yeshuas and Refuas and Parnasa to all those in need. The Rebbeinu Shalom should send simchas. We should have B'suras Tovos. We should go now. We just had a beautiful Purim. We had Purim. We're in Adar. We should nichtas Adar Marbel Simcha. The Kolshke Nisan. We're looking forward to Pesach, the Zman HaGeula. And from here on out, we should only know from Simcha. The Rebbeinu Shalom should bring us Simcha And of course, when we have the simcha, we should remember the Churban Bayis. The Rosh Hashanah should bring the Geula Shlema. We should be zecher to live like true Torah Yidden. We should be zecher to the Bias Gal Tzedek B'Meher V'Yameinu. Amen. Be well.